Now let's get this day started. I'm pleased to introduce to you all our first speaker of the day, Garry Leech. Garry Leech is a journalist and an author who worked as a war correspondent in Colombia for 13 years, as well as Venezuela, Cuba, and the West Bank. In 2016, he was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. His latest book, Ghosts Within, Journeying Through PTSD, reveals the long-term costs of violence and war and describes the realities of living with a mental illness. Please welcome Garry.
The images kept invading my mind. A faceless massacre victim, a woman being raped, a guerrilla fighter holding a gun to my head, a body hacked open with a machete. The images wouldn't go away. I couldn't stop myself thinking about them. The ghosts of my past were coming back to haunt me. It felt like they lived inside me, that they now controlled me. And along with the images came a flood of emotions: anger, sadness, guilt, remorse, self-hatred, and helplessness, besieging me from all angles. My mind felt like it was exploding. It was like an avalanche as the different emotions collided with each other inside my head, crashing down and flooding over me wave after wave. It was overwhelming. I just wanted it to stop. I sat in the chair in the corner of my bedroom, drinking a bottle of rum, but the alcohol wasn't numbing me. It wasn't stopping me from spiraling down. I continued to sit there with my head in my hands, besieged by the images and conflicting emotions. I began banging the palms of my hands against my head. "Make it go away," I pleaded in desperation to no one. The episode intensified over the next couple of hours until it reached the point that I felt the only way to end it, the only escape, was to kill myself. I imagined ways to do it. I didn't have a gun in the house, so that wasn't an option. I also didn't have medication to overdose on. I did have a Stanley knife in my toolbox in the cupboard above the washing machine. I went and retrieved the knife, returned to the bedroom, and placed it on the dresser beside me. I sat there staring at the knife. I imagined holding it in my hand and sliding out the razor-sharp blade. I then envisioned sticking that blade into my wrist and slowly cutting along the artery that runs up the forearm, visualizing the blood pouring out of the cut. I thought about how liberating it would be to die. But in that moment, as in all the other moments that I contemplated suicide, my thoughts went to my sons, Morgan and Owen. How could I do such a terrible thing to them when they were so young? It was agonizing to think of what losing their father might do to them. It would be the cruelest act. The thought of killing myself eventually passed. Once again, I'd been saved by Morgan and Owen. But while the thought of committing suicide passed, the emotional pain crashing around inside my head didn't. I got out of the chair and began pacing around the small room, pleading for the thoughts, feelings, and images to go away. I then began punching myself in the face. "It's never going to stop," I yelled angrily while hitting myself. And it didn't stop. I began banging my head hard against the wall. But eventually, slowly, the emotional pain did begin to subside. I seemed to be regaining control. As the episode wound down, I felt utterly exhausted and emotionally drained. I also felt simultaneously relieved and filled with dread, because I knew that I would have to endure another episode the following day or the one after that. For months, those episodes occurred every few days. They were relentless. I'd be walking on a thin line, but I'm sure not walking straight. Tried to leave something behind me. Maybe I left it a bit too late. Can't seem to get my head on straight. Don't always feel like getting out of bed. And I'm walking on a razor's edge. I'm walking on a razor's edge. There's a world I'd like to wash away, but I've nothing to replace it with. So I pour myself another drink, so I don't have to face it. I've spoken words that I thought I meant, but no one listened to a word I said. And I'm walking on a razor's edge. I'm walking on a razor. There's something that we should have, something to make the whole damn world laugh. Tell me what's wrong with this picture. I'd like to turn the world upside down. Do you think that this would fix it? To make a smile out of a frown. Can't seem to find a how-to book to organize the chaos in my head. And I'm walking on a razor's edge. I'm walking on a razor's edge. I'm walking on the edge. Those episodes began following an emotional breakdown I had in the city of Cali in Colombia in November 2016. For more than a decade, I had witnessed horrific injustices in Colombia's conflict zones. I'd visited massacre sites, and the images of those dead bodies would remain ingrained in my memory. I had seen peasants who'd lost limbs to landmines, and sick children who'd been poisoned by chemicals sprayed on them by anti-drug fumigation planes. There were the villagers whose community had been occupied by paramilitaries who systematically raped most of the women and girls. There was the woman who spent a long night lying wounded with her baby amidst the dead bodies of 119 people in the rubble of a church bombed by leftist guerrillas. And there were the countless women and children who'd been forcibly displaced from their homes and who had to live the precarious lives of refugees in dangerous shanty towns. It was not only the violence and terror perpetrated against others that I was exposed to, but also the threat of violence against me. Working in conflict zones required functioning constantly with a heightened sense of awareness. I was on edge all the time, anticipating a sudden burst of gunfire, a bomb attack, or an encounter with a military checkpoint. On numerous occasions, I'd accompanied army, guerrilla, and paramilitary patrols, in constant anticipation of being ambushed or stepping on a landmine. On one occasion, I was surrounded by automatic gunfire in the middle of a major nighttime battle that occurred when guerrillas attacked the town I was working in. I regularly came upon the checkpoints of armed groups, never knowing whether I was going to be detained and interrogated or kidnapped or killed. On 3 occasions, I'd been detained and held captive by armed groups. During 2 of those detentions, I was held on remote farms in the jungle and interrogated and threatened with death. They were the most terrifying experiences of my life. The sense of impotence was overwhelming. I had no control over whether I would walk out of there alive. My future, if I was to have one, rested entirely on the decisions of local military commanders. Even at home, I wasn't safe from the threat of violence because I received death threats via email. As I sat in my Colombian hotel room reflecting on those experiences following my breakdown, I couldn't help but think about how much I hated war. While growing up, history classes in school had been full of stories of war. In fact, the timeline of our history seemed to be marked by wars, one after another. War was usually portrayed as one group of uniformed soldiers fighting against another group of uniformed soldiers. War was even portrayed as heroic, full of glory. But there was nothing heroic in war. There was no glory. I knew this from seeing war and its impacts with my own eyes. It was not only the armed combatants who bore the brunt of war, it was also the civilian population. In war, it was unarmed men, women, and children who were the principal victims of the violence. They suffered horrors virtually unimaginable. War revealed the darkest depths of human depravity. That reality was not taught in history classes. And after spending so many years witnessing the worst of what human beings were capable of doing to each other, it was difficult for me to have faith in humanity any longer. It was difficult for me to believe that human beings could create a better world, a more humane world. And while it might seem obvious to most people that repeatedly witnessing massacre sites and being held captive at gunpoint are traumatic experiences, but those and many other encounters had become so routine for me that they felt normal. Such experiences simply came with the territory, and I didn't stop to consider how they might be negatively affecting me. I felt that I had some special skill set that allowed me to do this type of work and to cope with the horrific things that I witnessed and experienced. In fact, I felt that I could handle anything. Obviously, I was wrong. Here it comes again. Another wave of pain, crashing round inside my head. Making me wish I was dead. Things I don't want to see. Coming back to haunt me. Trapped in my own private war. I can't take it anymore. So I scream and I shout and I try to shut it out as I down one more drink, so I don't have to think or feel. 'Cause it's all too real. I try so hard to hide from these ghosts lurking inside. 'Cause I'm not the man I used to be. That man is just another memory. So I scream and I shout and I try to shut it out as I down one more drink, so I don't have to think or feel. 'Cause it's all too real. Because of the plight faced by veterans of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, many people are now familiar with the term PTSD. Nevertheless, it still largely remains an invisible illness that most people don't really understand. Furthermore, most people don't realize that the largest demographic in North America with PTSD is not war veterans, but women who have suffered rape or sexual assault. People with PTSD can suffer from flashbacks, intrusive memories, nightmares, anxiety, social isolation, insomnia, depression, and suicidal thoughts. For me, the intrusive memories were one of the most disturbing aspects because they triggered powerful emotional responses. Numerous times a day, an image of a massacre victim, a woman being raped, a limbless landmine casualty, or a combatant holding me captive at gunpoint would flash through my mind, leaving me feeling vulnerable and threatened. The intrusive memories distorted my reality in the moment in which they occurred. Whatever or whoever I was looking at would be infused with images from the past, disconnecting me from the present. They were very disturbing and made it difficult to concentrate on what was happening in that moment. They would also often lead to emotional meltdowns and suicidal thoughts. The intrusive memories didn't only appear during the daytime, they also appeared at night. But unlike during the daytime, an image at night didn't just briefly flash in and out of my mind. It became embedded there. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get it out of my head. I would wake up in the middle of the night crying with one of those images stuck in my mind. A lifeless pregnant stomach, a rape, a faceless corpse, a hacked-up body. Initially, Terry would wake up worried about me. She tried to comfort me, but to no avail. It happened so often that we eventually decided it didn't make sense for her to lose a night's sleep as well. So she would wake up and, upon hearing me sobbing, ask if I was okay. And then she'd just go back to sleep. My PTSD symptoms dominated my life. In fact, for more than a year following my breakdown, PTSD alone defined who I was. If you'd asked me, who is Garry Leech, I would have answered, he is a person with PTSD. Nothing more. Not a father, not a grandfather, not a spouse, not a son, not a writer, not a teacher, not an activist. Just a broken man with a mental illness. I couldn't envision a life in which PTSD wouldn't dictate my every thought, feeling, and action for every single minute of every single day. In many ways, this was true for Terry, too. She couldn't imagine her life not being dominated by my PTSD. She began to wonder if living with someone with a mental illness meant being more of a caregiver than a partner. She also felt that our world had been effectively shattered and found it impossible to envision what our future might look like. Terry and I talked regularly with Morgan and Owen about my PTSD. They understood that it was a mental illness. They learned what had caused it without hearing all the details of my work in Colombia, and they knew I was in therapy trying to get better. We did our best to make the boys feel comfortable with my mental illness, to normalize it. Sometimes when I was triggered, Morgan would ask me, "Is it your PTSD, Dad?" And when I'd sit crying in the armchair in my bedroom, they would often come in and sit on my lap and hug me. They knew why I was crying, and they also knew that it would pass. Thankfully, most of the bad spiraling episodes occurred after they'd gone to bed, and they never saw me at my worst. Nevertheless, there was no way to ensure that my PTSD didn't impact Morgan and Owen. And regardless of how much we talked about it as a family, the consequences of living with me and my mental illness would undoubtedly impact their development in various ways. Passing trauma on to the next generation can be a serious consequence of PTSD. Perhaps there is no more extreme and tragic example of this in Canada than the intergenerational consequences of residential schools. For more than 100 years, encompassing virtually the entire 20th century, some 150,000 Aboriginal children were forcibly removed from their families and communities and placed into government-funded, church-run residential schools. Many were subjected to physical abuse, manual labor, and even deprived of food in malnutrition experiments, in addition to being prohibited from speaking their language or engaging with their culture in any other way. The objective was cultural genocide, by eradicating the culture of Aboriginal peoples and then assimilating them into the dominant white settler society. One of the tragic outcomes was collective and intergenerational trauma. There are no reliable nationwide statistics for Aboriginal peoples regarding the prevalence of PTSD, sometimes referred to as residential school syndrome because of its unique cultural dimension. However, a 2009 report in the Journal of Aboriginal Health revealed that 64% of residential school survivors in BC had the mental illness. PTSD doesn't only impact the next generation, it also impacts the loved ones in the here and now. As time passed, I felt more and more on edge. If Terry dropped a spoon on the kitchen floor when I was in the living room, it would feel as though my heart was jumping out of my chest, and I would immediately feel intense anxiety in the pit of my stomach. My outward response would also be instantaneous. "What the hell was that?" I would yell aggressively. "It's just a spoon," Terry would answer. "How hard is it to hold onto a spoon?" I would respond angrily. Unbeknownst to Terry and me at the time, I was existing in a state of hyperarousal. I was subconsciously switched on all the time. Because of my PTSD, my brain perceived everything, even the sound of a spoon hitting the floor, as a threat. This is a natural state of brain function in a war zone, where dangers are ever present, and therefore the emotional brain is constantly on guard and ready to activate the reptilian brain to shift into survival mode. However, it is not a natural state of brain function when living in a safe environment. In fact, it is highly dysfunctional. But because of this state of hyperarousal, the sound of a spoon hitting the floor triggered a response in me equal to the reaction that would be triggered by the sound of a gunshot or an explosion in a war zone. So while the actual threat had existed in the past, my emotional response occurred in the present. It was like living in a time warp. We learned that Terry was experiencing secondary trauma due to living with someone with PTSD. Hyperarousal became a constant state for her too. Her hyperarousal was not PTSD related because it was not rooted in past traumatic experiences. Instead, it was rooted in the very real and present threat that I could react angrily at any moment. If she dropped something, she would freeze in anticipation of my response. If I was having a bad day, then she would be afraid that anything she said might set me off. Often, while driving home from work, Terry would worry about who she was going to encounter when she entered the house, Stalin or Santa, as she labeled my two personalities. During quieter moments, before we knew I had PTSD, Terry would ask me, "Why can't you just pause for a moment before you explode and think about what's happening?" I would tell her that I just couldn't do it. The explosion would ignite so fast that I had no time to reflect beforehand. I could see the explosion happening, almost as though I were outside of my body watching myself, but I couldn't stop it. It didn't make sense to me or to Terry. I had always been a person with a large degree of self-control who was very disciplined and effective at managing or changing behaviors I didn't like. But now I had no control over my reactions, and it felt like I had suddenly become possessed by an alien entity. In actuality, I'd become possessed by my reptilian brain, which seized control from my rational brain at the first sign of a potential threat and put me into survival mode. So while Terry viewed me as either Santa or Stalin, I felt like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. My normal, rational and happy Dr. Jekyll personality would become the horrible Mr. Hyde at the drop of a pin. And as the years went on, Mr. Hyde slowly took over. He eventually became the dominant personality. I hated Mr. Hyde, but no matter how hard I tried, I could not get rid of him or prevent him from rearing his ugly head. My PTSD caused me to shrink my world down to a very small and manageable size that included very few people. I moved an armchair and television into our bedroom and turned it into a man cave. I spent 20 hours a day in my man cave and rarely left the house. It was the only way that I felt safe. After a while, I changed my appearance so that no one would recognize me. For years, my head had been shaved and I'd mostly worn black clothes, a carryover from my New York days. But I grew back my hair and a full beard and began wearing different colored clothes and a hat. People who knew me would walk right past me without a flicker of recognition, and that was fine with me. I didn't change my appearance only so that others wouldn't recognize me, but also so I wouldn't recognize myself. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't want to see myself as I had looked before. It reminded me of who I had been and of all the things that I was no longer capable of doing. I wasn't that person anymore. I no longer knew who I was. Looking all around, everywhere I go for the guy walking around in my shoes. 'Cause I can't seem to find myself anywhere, and I'm not sure what to do. I get up every morning and I look into the mirror, but there's somebody else looking back. I used to know that face a long time ago, but now there's something that it lacks. I just wanna be me. Just wanna be me. Now I know we've all got a ghost or two among the skeletons buried in the closet, but I know there's more than that missing in me, and I'd like to know who's got it. It seems there's always somebody trying to tell me how to live my life. Don't they see they're really not talking to me, but to the stranger lurking inside? I just wanna be me. I just wanna be me. I don't know what I'm meant to do or who I'm supposed to be. The only thing I know for sure is I'm looking all around, everywhere I go for the guy walking around in my shoes. 'Cause I can't seem to find myself anywhere, and I'm not sure what to do. 'Cause I just wanna be me. 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 Just wanna be me. 7 months after my breakdown, we traveled to Panama to visit family. We were staying at a jungle lodge, and one day we were all taking a walk along a quiet country road that weaved its way through the rainforest. At one point, I heard the faint and distinctive sound of a helicopter in the distance. We sighted it off to our left near the horizon. It was coming towards us, and the sound grew louder and louder. The sound of it instantly transported me back to Colombia. Because many of Colombia's conflict zones were in remote jungle, often the only access in and out of those regions was by helicopter. As the helicopter approached, I began to struggle with intrusive memories that suddenly started invading my mind. The sound of the helicopter's whirring and pulsating blades reverberated in my head. It flew over us, and as it disappeared off into the distance, the sound slowly faded away. The kids were excited to see a helicopter fly so close overhead. The other adults were not fazed by the occurrence. Meanwhile, I was struggling to hold it together during our walk back to the lodge. When I arrived back at the lodge, all covered in sweat from the heat and humidity, I went for a swim in the river in the front of our cabin. I was attempting to eradicate the intrusive memories triggered by the helicopter as much as I was trying to cleanse myself. Suddenly, sitting on the bank of that jungle river, I began flashing back to Colombia. I couldn't stop myself from looking upstream, convinced that a boat carrying guerrillas or paramilitaries was about to come around the bend. Flashbacks were relatively rare for me. My re-experiencing mostly consisted of intrusive memories. But in that moment, every fiber of my being felt that I was in Colombia. I was convinced of it. I struggled desperately to locate and connect with my rational mind. I'm in Panama, I told myself. This is not Colombia, it's Panama. But I didn't believe it. I was in Colombia and about to encounter an armed group on that jungle river. I just sat there, staring upstream, waiting for the boat full of armed fighters to appear. I felt paralyzed as panic rose inside me. I'm in Panama, I desperately reiterated to myself. This is Panama. Terry came down to the river and immediately recognized the state I was in. She could tell when I was flashing back by the look on my face. She sat down beside me and, looking into my eyes, tried to reassure me that we were indeed in Panama and not Colombia. But it was all to no avail, because, as Dr. Van der Kolk has pointed out in his book, The Body Keeps the Score, no matter how much insight and understanding we develop, the rational brain is basically impotent to talk the emotional brain out of its own reality. Eventually, the flashback passed, and I began to calm down as I recognized my surroundings. But though the flashback had passed, the episode was not yet over. That night, I had a nightmare. I was lying inside a helicopter that was plummeting towards the ground. There were dead bodies lying on either side of me. I recognized the bodies. They were massacre victims I'd seen in Colombia. One was a young man who had a bullet hole in his forehead. The other was a pregnant woman who had a bullet hole in her cheek. The helicopter continued its rapid descent. Why hasn't it hit the ground yet? I asked myself. Surely we should have crashed by now. But we hadn't, and it just kept plummeting. The weight of the dead bodies was pressing against me. I felt trapped and was struggling to breathe. Why haven't we crashed yet? I didn't understand it. There was no way we could fall for that amount of time without hitting the ground. It was taking an eternity. Suddenly, my body began shaking. I opened my eyes and saw an angel. But I wasn't in the dream anymore. The shaking of my body had been Terry waking me up. I looked around the room. It took a few moments to get my bearings. You were having a nightmare, Terry explained. You were thrashing around the bed and yelling. I looked at her and said, when I opened my eyes, I thought you were an angel. Before adding, then I realized it was just you. We laughed and lay there hugging each other. Slowly, I began to feel grounded again. It took me a long time to get back to sleep. The 9 months of therapy that I did with Todd Vassallo brought me back from the edge and stabilized me. A year after my breakdown in Colombia, I began doing EMDR therapy with Emily Bushell. Emily and I started methodically working our way through my long list of traumatic experiences. 3 weeks into my EMDR, I noticed that I was having fewer intrusive memories and was sleeping better. After 7 weeks, the intrusive memories had largely stopped. They could still be triggered like any other memory if something consciously reminded me of them, but my emotional responses were no longer as powerful and overwhelming. Instead, they were only mildly disturbing and largely consisted of sadness. It was an incredible feeling of relief to not have those horrific images regularly invading my mind throughout each day. I finally felt liberated from them. After 20 sessions of EMDR over 3 months, I felt that I was finally exorcising the ghosts that had tormented me for years. My mental illness no longer controls me to the degree it did over much of the past 6 years. I am no longer merely existing. I finally feel like I am discovering a new me and I'm beginning to live again. I still have crying sessions and moments when everything is doom and gloom, but they are not as frequent. And I still endure anxiety, hyperarousal, and contraction on a daily basis, but they are less intense, so I can function much better. And I will likely have to endure these PTSD symptoms to some degree or another for the rest of my life. But most importantly, I no longer feel entirely defined by my PTSD. I am lucky. Far too many others with PTSD are not so fortunate. Show me a world of wisdom, a world not living just to die. Show me a world of laughter, a world not crying all the time. Won't someone show me, someone please show me what that world's like. Won't someone show me, someone please show me what that world's like. Show me a world of passion, a world where eyes are burning bright. Show me some indication of a world that cares what's right. Won't someone show me, someone please show me what that world's like. Won't someone show me, someone please show me what that world's like. Show me a world of justice, a world not ruled by military might. Show me love and compassion, and not this world full of hatred and spite. Won't someone show me, someone please show me what that world's like. Won't someone show me, someone please show me what that world's like. Won't someone show me, someone please show me what that world's like. Thank you. Okay, what I'd like to do now is open it up for questions, comments, and I know mental health is a difficult thing to talk about, so everything is open. Anything you want to ask, I'm willing to try and answer. And I'd also like to invite my partner, Terry Gibbs, up to participate in this part of the session. To give the perspective of a family member who has to live with someone with PTSD or a mental illness. So we're both willing to take questions and listen to comments. So Terry Gibbs.
I just want to thank you, first of all, for telling your story. It was extremely incredible and powerful and empowering. I just wanted to ask you about, can you hear me okay?
Just a little more audio on that mic, yeah.
I could talk louder too. So I know that you said that you got EMDR for the PTSD symptoms. I live with PTSD too, and I have a lot of friends that do as well. Do you know, is there something that specifically worked for you when it came to, like, if you were in a flashback that bring you out of it? Did you have coping skills that helped you manage, grounding yourself back to the present moment? Something that kind of helped you get out of it faster or prevent them from happening, especially with like unexpected triggers?
No. Actually, at first, no, but my therapist, Todd Vassallo, at that time, like in the situation I talked about in Panama, flashing back to being in Colombia on a jungle river, he gave me one tool for the future, and that was to say, instead of just trying to convince myself I'm in Panama and not Colombia, just look at that bend in the river and say, if nothing appears in 10 seconds, then I'm safe. And if nothing appears at another 10 seconds after that, I'm safe. There's a way to just try and reassure that I'm safe. But in the other times I had flashbacks after that, that all went out of my head anyway. And at the height of my PTSD, I actually couldn't find anything that would bring me back from a flashback or stop the intrusive memories invading my head. For me, it was just, I just had to go through it and come out the other end, and sometimes that would be hours and hours. But after the EMDR therapy, mostly that stuff stopped. And during the EMDR, in the months I was doing it, those episodes would get shorter and shorter and less intense. So the therapy, along with medication, helped diminish those. But as far as actual tools to bring myself back in the height of them, in the moment, no.
Thank you very much.
Is there anybody has a question? I can see someone moving toward the microphone right now.
Hey, thanks for sharing your story, but also your music. That was great. I noticed a few times in your lyrics you spoke about alcohol, and I was wondering what kind of role that played on your journey and how you might have combat that during that time.
Yeah, it's played a significant role. And it still does to some degree, but thankfully not as much as it did for a few years. Alcohol, for me, it was an anxiety reducer. It was the only thing. The anxiety was so unbearable. And every day, day in and day out, every minute, there was never a minute where I still don't have any moments without anxiety, except when I drink alcohol. But my anxiety is a lot lower now than it used to be. But it used to be just relentless, and doing anything, just running to the store, would be anxiety-inducing and paralyzing. Anti-anxiety medication would diminish it, but never get rid of it. For some reason, it was the only thing. I tried cannabis. It would diminish it, but not get rid of it. It was the only thing that ever gave me that moments of relief, like, I don't feel that. So I developed a dependency on it. As my therapy went on and all these symptoms diminished and now they exist at a much lower level, then I don't drink as much as I did during the height of my crisis. But it is still the only thing that can completely eliminate that anxiety and that feeling of just, if it's just for a couple hours in the evening of... so it's an ongoing struggle because I haven't found another way to get rid of that. But alcohol is not as big an issue now as it was a couple of years ago. And you mentioned my music. My music was a huge tool to help me during the height of my crisis especially. Mostly I was playing a lot of piano at the time. But sitting down at the piano, and I played for hours every day, because I had to focus so much on playing piano, it kept my mind fully present in that present moment. It stopped it drifting into the past and triggering me or worrying about the future and ramping up my anxiety. So music was a major component of coping mechanism for me.
Thanks so much.
I'm going to maybe just follow up on that. And we were listening to the songs that you were that you were presenting, and thinking about the lyrics. And one of the lyrics you wrote was, "I spoke the words I thought I must, but no one heard a word I said." And there's an isolation in that. And like, to what extent, when you were sharing those songs, did people know what you were singing about? I'm wondering about sort of how people interacted with that music.
I don't know, actually. I've never had anyone really tell me how they responded specifically to the songs. Yeah, but you hit on something very important there, isolation. One of the most challenging things for me in dealing with this mental illness has been that sense of feeling alone and isolated, that other people don't understand what you're going through, and the pressure to feel like I've got to act normal when I'm out in public, even though I don't feel like it. And just the feeling that, again, because the stigma around mental illness, that I'm alone. I just feel so alone. And even with Terry, who's been amazing, and I could not be where I am today without Terry. But she had to learn whole new communication skills, because in the middle of my episode she'd go, "It's going to be all right, it's going to be okay." And that's the last thing I wanted to hear. I didn't hear that. What I heard is, "You don't understand what I'm going through right now, because it's not going to be okay." At that moment, in the midst of these spiraling episodes, nothing's ever going to be okay again. Nothing. Which is why often I end up thinking about suicide, because this is never going to end. So, yeah, that sense of isolation, that you're alone, is crushing. And maybe Terry could talk to that too, about coping with that.
Yeah. Don't know where to start.
There's a question from Andy Ganesh that might help you.
Okay.
I just got it, and they said, "Terry, how did you care for yourself during this time?"
Right. Well, it's kind of funny because in my many hats, I work in conflict resolution and communication and all of that stuff. So I had this big toolbox that I thought, okay, I can get lots of stuff out of here. That will be really helpful. And what I realized is that my tools were not working, and things that I thought would make sense in the situation didn't. And so it was a learning process for me to realize that sometimes I'd always thought, we got to talk everything through to every little last detail to figure it out. But sometimes he just needed me to be there, not saying anything, and to know that I cared about him, but that we didn't need to kind of explore everything in detail at that moment. And that was a learning. And I'm an incredibly positive, optimistic person. And sometimes I think that was just plain old annoying. So what I learned was to sort of go, everything's going to be all right. It's like, no, it's actually not. It's really messed up and horrible and awful, and that's where it is right now. So I think me sort of coming into that space of going, okay, that's where we are. And that actually, as Garry said, not sort of wipe away what the person is feeling, but to actually just really be there and hear them. It's shitty and it's awful. Okay, that's where we're at right now, and to be there with it. Taking care of myself, I think it's important that hopefully you have friends around. Not everybody is lucky to have friends or support around. That was really important for me, to make sure that I could get away sometimes and just be in other spaces, and to know that there were people that I could call on. And we sort of developed systems ourselves too. If there's a crisis, what are we going to do? Phone the neighbors, phone 911, whatever it is that we have to do. And so we kind of developed systems to work with it. I think it's important too to recognize your own limits and your own boundaries in these situations. So if you're, I wouldn't say luckily violence was never happening to me, but I think there are many people in situations where it can be violent and there can be a threat. And so the way in which you're giving this support, you need to have some professional support, family support, community support, but to also know that there might be a time where it's okay for you to leave a situation and to get out of it for your own protection. And I think sometimes people stay beyond that point, and that can be dangerous and harmful. It can be dangerous in terms of actual physical danger, but it can also be dangerous in terms of what can happen to your self-esteem if you continue to put yourself in situations where you feel undermined or less than. So it's important to have that support. And sometimes we have a little barn up in the property. Sometimes I would just run up there and be like, okay, I just need a few minutes to be by myself. Yes. Oh, and yeah, thanks for reminding me. I became involved in a group, Families Matter, which probably most of you are aware of. And that was sort of allowing family members, caregivers, to get together and talk about their experiences. And that was incredibly helpful. We would meet once a week for a couple of hours, and just to hear other people's stories was super helpful. And it's not that you're necessarily solving all your problems, but you're kind of normalizing it and saying, okay, I'm not crazy. This whole situation is workable, and that was really, really helpful. So I would definitely suggest and recommend that people look for those kinds of supports, as well as friends and family. Yeah.
How you doing? As an Indigenous person, I have a question of how do you feel intergenerational consequences relate to a person with PTSD?
I've seen personally that my children have been impacted by my PTSD, but not solely in negative ways, in positive ways too, because of the environment they're in and the communication we have with them and the sharing, that it's helping them normalize mental illness, feel compassion, and like I said in part of my reading there, that, they're not afraid of me. They'll come up and they'll hug me and stuff when I'm... So I think there's potential positives depending on the environment. With regard to residential schools, though, that's not going to be a reality. It's going to be mostly harmful consequences. And the problem is if someone, especially youth, like Indigenous children in residential schools, are traumatized and it's not dealt with in a healthy, positive way, which of course it wasn't in residential schools, then people grow up, they have PTSD, and they don't even realize they have PTSD. And then all of a sudden, as a consequence, there's all this abusive behavior, sometimes physical, often psychological, because they've never dealt with their trauma, and so they're traumatizing then the next generation. And as I said, one of the astounding statistics I came across in my research was that in that one study, 64% of residential school survivors in British Columbia had PTSD. That's a huge figure. Because to put that in context, about 40% of women who have experienced rape and sexual assault have PTSD. About 30% are combat veterans, 29% of war correspondents, and about 15% of first responders. So 64% is huge. And I think that is something that needs to be focused on a lot more in reconciliation, is stop this perpetual passing on of trauma from generation to generation.
Am I on? Okay. I just wanted to add to that, and sort of related, I think often people can feel like this is my isolated experience, and that's where the loneliness and despair happen. But I think my learning through this is that PTSD is a family affair, it's a community affair, it can even be a cultural affair. Some of the communities that we worked in Colombia, whole towns have PTSD because of the trauma they experienced. And certainly in the case of the residential school issue, I think this is also about Canada's healing, if you like. This is a process for the whole country, not just for our First Nations, Indigenous people. And that's going to require some social change. And if we look at the huge statistics in terms of women suffering from PTSD, that's not just single, isolated women's experience. That's an issue of a broader social problem of patriarchy. And so we have to, I think, look at the individuals and care for them, but recognize that working through these things is a social collective affair. And part of that is also doing this kind of thing, normalizing the discussions that people can realize and feel less isolated, and to be able to feel like they can go out and get help without feeling shame about that.
I'm going to stop it right here, if that's okay with you. Thank you, Garry, and thank you, Terry, for sharing your story with us today.
Thank you for having us.